What if I told you there's a funny looking 2 mana skeleton that will draw you more cards than most 6 mana commanders and that will completely lock your opponents out of the game? Tinybones Trinket Thief. For 2 mana we get a 1/2 skeleton rogue that is easily one of the most efficient value engines ever printed for one of the most oppressive archetypes in Commander. Discard. Let's start with his first ability. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, you get to draw a card and you lose 1 life. And the best part about this ability is the fact that it doesn't only trigger at the end of our turn. It will trigger at the end of every player's turn. Meaning that in a 4-player game you can just make one opponent discard 1 card every turn and Tinybones will draw you up to 4 new cards per turn cycle. And just keep in mind that we are getting this absurd amount of card advantage on just a 2 mana commander. Our little skeleton man will turn this card, which by the way already slows opponents down by a ton, into a massive card draw engine. We aren't just going to be stripping our opponents of resources, we will be actively refilling our own hand while we do it. And that's honestly what makes Tinybones this dangerous. Your opponents will slowly be running out of cards in their hand while you are constantly drawing new ones. But Tinybones doesn't just generate us value, he also gives us a way to close out the game with his activated ability. By paying 6 mana we can make each opponent that has no cards in their hand lose 10 life, giving us a built-in win condition once our discard engines have done their job. Once your opponents are hellbent, meaning they don't have any cards left in their hands, Tinybones suddenly turns into a clock that will take massive chunks out of everyone's life total all at once. You don't have to attack, you don't have to assemble any sort of combo, you just press the button and you start chunking opponents. Now before we go any further, there is something important to say about both Tinybones and discard decks in general. Even though this deck is built on a €100 budget and it is technically a bracket 2 deck on paper, discard is one of the most oppressive strategies in the entire Commander format. You're not just gonna be slowing people down, you're gonna be stripping them of their win conditions, their interaction, and even their ability to just participate in the game. Lower power decks simply won't have the tools available to deal with this kind of strategy. So please, don't take this deck to casual tables and wonder why you're not invited to game nights anymore. And just to put into perspective how powerful this deck can be, one of my close friends, Mishkin, who plays a fully optimized bracket 4 version of this deck, has a hard rule for it. Before he even takes the deck out of the box, he asks the table if they are okay with playing against Tinybones. And if at least 2 of his opponents say no, he just takes out a different deck. That's how brutal discard strategies really are. And even though this is a budget build, it needs to be treated with the same respect. So make sure your opponents are on board with you pulling out the funny looking skeleton. Like I mentioned, this entire deck can be built on a €100 budget. Not counting Tinybones himself, because for some weird reason it is a €25 card. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 5 categories: the discard package, draw and support, the win conditions, protection and interaction, and the lands. Let's get started with the backbone of this deck, the discard package. Every card in this section is here to do one thing: rip cards out of our opponent's hands. These are the tools that will make Tinybones draw us a ton of cards, keep all of our opponents hellbent, and make sure that our opponents never actually get to play the game. Hopeless Nightmare, a 1-mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will make each opponent discard a card and lose 2 life. The fact that you get a one-sided discard effect for just a low cost of 1 mana makes it into one of the most efficient cards in the entire deck. And whenever you do have Tinybones on the battlefield, this card will act as some sort of a cantrip, because at the end of the turn Tinybones will see that an opponent discarded a card and you will get to draw a new card, basically making this card replace itself. And as you will see later in the video, we do actually win the game by slowly draining down our opponents. So the 2 life they lose against this effect is actually quite relevant. And whenever this enchantment is put into your graveyard, you get to scry 2, allowing you to manipulate the top cards of your library and just set up your draws for your future turns. And you can easily make this card go to your graveyard by paying 3 mana and sacrificing it. Now I'm gonna be honest, I've never ever used this effect, but I suppose if you do get into the late game and you have no cards cards to play and you do have some mana to spare, it can be a nice way to just ensure you draw the right card on your next turn. Vicious Rumors, a 1 mana sorcery that will deal 1 damage to each opponent, make each opponent discard a card, makes each opponent mill a card, and we will get to gain 1 life. And just like the previous card, it is a fantastic way to get a free Tinybones trigger replacing itself and to just rip cards from your opponent's hands. Now, even though you can play these 1 mana cards as early as turn 1, in most cases it will be better to wait until you have your Tinybones on the battlefield so that you can guarantee that these cards will draw you a new card. Mindlash Sliver, a 1 mana sliver that will give all slivers on the battlefield a new activated ability. For 1 generic mana and sacrificing this creature, each player will have to discard a card. And the best part about this card is the fact that you can use its ability on instant speed. So instead of using this effect during our own turn, we can just wait until an opponent's turn, use this ability, and we will get a Tinybones trigger during their end step, which is a really nifty way to just ensure that we will get more Tinybones triggers per turn cycle. And you can do some really nasty things whenever you are able to discard on instant speed. Because let's say you have been doing your discarding thing and an opponent has no cards in their hand. You can then just pass the turn to them, they will get to untap, then they will go to their upkeep, and they will then go to their draw step and draw their card for the turn. At the end of the beginning phase, you will then get priority and get the opportunity to use any sort of instant speed spell or activated ability. If you then use the ability of this sliver, you can make that opponent discard a card they just drew, and since they never got to their main phase, if it is a creature, a land, a planeswalker, an enchantment, anything that isn't an instant speed spell, they won't have a card to play for that turn, which obviously will just lock them out of the game for that given turn. Tinybones Joins Up, a 1 mana legendary enchantment that does mention Tinybones in its name. Whenever it enters the battlefield, any number of target players will have to discard a card, making it function in exactly the same way as a Hopeless Nightmare. And if you do have some cards in your hand with the Madness mechanic, you can even target yourself with this effect. Now, while this discard ability is the main reason why this card is included in the deck, it also has another passive effect. Whenever any legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent will have to mill 1 card and they will lose 1 life. A nice little drain effect that will trigger whenever we play Tinybones or any other legendary creature that will just speed up the clock that our opponents are already on. Next up, we're playing 5 2-drop creatures that all have exactly the same effect. A Burglar Rat, an Elderfang Disciple, Hectice, Nezumi Informant, and a Virus Beetle. Whenever any of these creatures enter the battlefield, each opponent will have to discard a card. And these cards are included for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, they will cripple our opponent's hands by making them discard. Whenever we do have Tinybones on the battlefield and we play any of these creatures, they will turn into cantrips because they will draw us a card thanks to Tinybones. Since all of these effects come attached to small creature bodies, we will get a ton of chum blockers to protect our life total with. And as you will see later in this video, we do play a ton of recursion tools in this deck to make sure we can get these creatures back from our graveyard either to our hand or to the battlefield. And whenever we do reanimate or recast them from our hand, we will get another discard trigger. And since we are playing a discard deck and a huge amount of creature removal, you will actually be able to swing with these small creature bodies to just whittle down your opponent's life totals. Rotting Rats, another 2-drop creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will make each player discard a card. Now, unlike the previous 2-drop creatures that I talked about, this card's discard effect will also apply to ourselves. But in most cases, that isn't really a downside. We will always have a huge amount of cards in our hand thanks to Tinybones, and we do play a couple of cards with the Madness mechanic that we actually do want to discard. And this card also has its own built-in recursion. Whenever this card is in your graveyard, either due to blocking by it, discarding it, sacrificing it, you can pay 2 mana to unearth it, meaning it will return from your graveyard to the battlefield, it will give you another discard trigger, and then at the end of turn it will get exiled. A fantastic 2-drop body that will give you 2 discard triggers. triggers. Smallpox. For 2 black mana you get an absolutely miserable card. Each player will lose 1 life, they will have to sacrifice 1 creature, discard a card, and sacrifice a land. Yeah, obviously this card is included for the table-wide discard trigger, but all of the other effects are just fantastic for this deck. You will get some free damage, you will get board control by making everyone sacrifice a creature, which in most cases they won't have many of because most of them will be discarded anyways, and making everyone sacrifice a land will slow down the game by a huge amount. The longer the game goes on, the better this deck actually gets. Arterial Flow. For 3 mana, each opponent will have to discard 2 cards. Now paying 3 mana for a one-sided discard 6 effect is already some really good value. And a card like this is just the perfect turn 3 play after you resolve your Tinybones on turn 2. Because you will get to draw a card of this effect and you will be forcing your opponents to discard any valuable cards in their hand they wanted to play on a later turn. And whenever you do control a vampire, whenever you cast a spell, each opponent will also lose 2 life and you get to gain 2 life. While that part of the ability isn't really all that relevant, we do play a total of 2 vampires in the deck, and it does feel quite nice when you can get the additional effect. Necrogen Mists, a 3 mana enchantment that at the beginning of each player's upkeep will make that player discard a card. And a card like this is what Tinybones is all about, because it will guarantee you at least 3 Tinybones triggers per turn cycle, since the discarding will be happening during each of your opponent's turns, on top of being a really oppressive effect that will just cripple your opponent's hands. And a really similar card is Bottomless Pit, which is also a 3 mana enchantment with a really similar effect, but this time the discarded card will be chosen at random, arguably making it even better than a Necrogen Mists, because now your opponents don't actually get to choose what they discard. And if you get lucky, this card will pick the one card they want to desperately keep in their hand. Just keep in mind that these 2 enchantments will trigger during the upkeep phase of the active player. So if they start their turn with 0 cards in their hand, this effect will trigger, nothing will happen, and then they will get to draw cards. Delirium Skeins. For 3 mana, each player has to discard 3 cards, making this into the most cost-efficient discard spell ever printed because it will discard a total of 12 cards. Now obviously this effect also applies to us, and we will actually cripple ourselves whenever we cast this spell. But that being said, this card is just way too good not to include in the deck. If you can drop your Tinybones on turn 2 and then follow up with the spell on turn 3, you will be setting your opponents back into the Stone Age, barely leaving them with any cards in their hands, and you will be able to really quickly just refill your hand thanks to Tinybones' ability. Liliana of the Veil, the hottest card we play in this deck. It's a 3 mana planeswalker that is just the perfect fit for this type of deck. Her +1 loyalty ability will make each player discard a card, triggering all of the discard synergies we play in this deck, giving us a free card of Tinybones, and just ripping apart our opponent's hands. Her -2 ability will make target opponents sacrifice a creature. Now in most cases, our opponents will barely ever be controlling any creature, since they will just be discarded to any of our effects. But whenever they do cast their commander and it does pose a problem to you, you can then just use Liliana's ability to get rid of it. And if you do get to 6 loyalty, you can use Liliana's ultimate ability, which will allow you to separate all the permanents target player controls into 2 separate piles. They then will get to pick one pile and the other pile will just get sacrificed. And trust me, whenever you do use this on an opponent, they won't ever be able to come back from this, because you can just make the piles in a really smart way and they will have to decide between any of their value permanents or their lands. Now while usually getting to the ultimate ability of planeswalkers is a really hard thing to do, since we will be slowing the game down by a lot thanks to our discarding, and due to the fact that we will always be controlling these small sacrifice fodder creatures, you will usually be able to protect your Liliana and make her generate you a huge amount of value. Mindrake. For 3 mana you can make target player discard 2 cards, but we won't ever be casting it for its regular mana cost. We will always be casting this card for its overload cost, which will make each player discard 2 cards for just 2 mana. Discarding a total of 8 cards for just 2 mana is a really efficient deal. And fun fact, I do believe this is one of the only cards in existence where the overload cost is actually lower than the regular mana cost. Oppression, a really oppressive card. Whenever any player casts any spell, they have to discard a card. Yeah, this card is just nuts. This card will punish your opponents for just playing the game. If you are able to play your Tinybones on turn 2 and follow up with this card on turn 3, if your opponents don't have an answer for this card, the game is basically just over. Because if they now cast like 1 or 2 spells, their hand will just be completely empty. And this card will obviously give you a huge amount of Tinybones triggers, which will make sure we aren't really affected by our own Oppression's effect, because we will always be having a gazillion cards in our hand. Now this card doesn't really have any effect if your opponents only have 1 card in their hand, because they will just be able to cast it and nothing will be discarded. But it will force all of your opponents to go into some sort of top deck mode, which is exactly where we want them. Words of Waste, a 3 mana enchantment with an activated ability for 1 generic mana, which whenever we use it will prevent the next card we draw from any source, but instead will make each opponent discard a card. And we can replace any sort of draw with this effect. The card we draw during our draw step, the cards we will be drawing of Tinybones, or the cards we draw from any of the other effects we play in this deck. Just be warned that you can't actually use this card to gain extra benefit out of Tinybones' card draw, because Tinybones' trigger will happen at the beginning of the end step, and if you then use this effect to replace that card draw, this effect will also happen during that end step, and you won't actually be getting any additional cards drawn from Tinybones. But you will get a huge amount of extra discard triggers, and usually whenever you do have a Words of Waste on the battlefield, it is really easy to make all of your opponents go to 0 cards in their hand. Let's play a game. A 4 mana sorcery that will make us choose 1 out of its 3 options. We can make all creatures our opponents control get -1/-1 until the end of turn, giving us a really solid way to deal with any sort of token deck. We can make each opponent discard 2 cards, or we can make each opponent lose 3 life and we get to gain 3 life. Obviously, all 3 of the effects on this card are really potent. But the best part is that whenever we do have the Delirium mechanic active, meaning we have a total of 4 different card types in our graveyard, we actually get to pick all 3 of its effects. And since we do play a ton of really cheap spells, and we will also be discarding our own cards, it is really easy to get the Delirium mechanic active, and this card will provide you with a huge amount of value for just 4 mana. Necrogoyf, a 5 mana creature with a Necrogen Mist attached to it. Because for as long as this card is on the battlefield, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they will have to discard a card, giving us a ton of Tinybones triggers, triggering all of our discard synergies, and just crippling our opponent's hands even further. And this creature's power will be equal to the total amount of creature cards in all graveyards combined. Now in my experience, a Necrogoyf will always have somewhere between 10 to 20 power. And due to us being a discard deck with a huge amount of spot removal, you will easily be able to connect with your Necrogoyf to your opponents and just take like 20 life out of their life totals, making it function as a great discard engine and an actual win condition. And my favorite part about this card is the fact that it has the Madness mechanic, meaning whenever we do discard this card, we get the option to pay 3 mana and cast it instead of making it go to our graveyard. As you've seen, we do play a ton of self-discard effects, which you can just discard your Necrogoyf to. You will then be able to cast it for a cost reduction, paying just 3 mana for it, and you didn't actually lose a card in discarding because you got this creature on the battlefield instead. And the last card in this section is a Tassigur's Cruelty. For 6 mana, each opponent will have to discard 2 cards, which obviously is an absolutely horrible deal. Good thing that this card also has the Delve mechanic, meaning whenever we cast it, we can exile any number of cards from our graveyard, and for each card we exile this way, its cost will be reduced by 1 generic mana. With all of the local spells and all of the self-discarding we will be doing, we will always have a huge amount of cards in our graveyard, and you will always be able to cast this spell for just the 1 black mana, making it into a really efficient discard spell. Next up, we have the draw and the support section. Destroying our opponent's hands means nothing if we do run out of gas ourselves. These are the cards that will make sure we can keep drawing cards on top of the card draw we already get from Tinybones, and the support cards make the deck a lot more consistent and they give us a huge amount of utility. Bag of Holding, a simple 1 mana artifact that whenever we do discard a card, we'll exile it instead. For 4 mana and sacrificing this artifact, we get to return all cards exiled with its effect to our hand. And this effect is just absolutely ridiculous, especially later in the game, because you can just play this artifact on turn 1 before you even get any of your discard engines going. Over the course of the game, you will then be discarding your cards to your own effects, and then you can just crack the back and get all of the discarded cards back into your hand, which will give you a huge card advantage swing, and you will have a ton of resources to start closing out the game with. For 2 mana and tapping this artifact, we also get the option to loot, meaning we get to draw a card and then discard a card, allowing us to dig deeper into our library just looking for the cards we need at the current given board state, and any card we do discard to the looting we can just get back with its other ability later in the game. Fraction Reclamation, a 1 mana enchantment with an activated ability. For 2 mana and 2 life, we get to return any creature in our graveyard to our hand, and this is one of the recursion engines I was talking about, because later in the game it does give us a way to get back any of our win condition creatures. We can use it to sort of bypass the commander tags that Tinybones has by just making it go to the graveyard, and most importantly it does give us a way to recur any of the 2-drop discard bodies we are playing in this deck. We can just keep recurring them over and over again, and we will be able to set up a consistent stream of constantly making our opponents discard. Springleaf Drum, a 1 mana artifact that by tapping it and tapping an untapped creature we control will allow us to add 1 mana to our mana pool. Since 99% of the time we will have our Tinybones or a discard fodder creature on the battlefield, a Springleaf Drum just functions as a 1 mana rock, always giving us access to 1 additional black mana, which will allow us to set up our discard engines, our discard spells, and our win conditions 1 turn earlier. Sol Ring. Yeah, obviously it is included, it is just the best mana rock in existence, and in this deck it will allow you to set up some really explosive turn 2 plays. You can play your Tinybones and a discard creature in a single turn, you will be able to play your Cryptghast on turn 2, and it even gives you a way to use your Bag of Holding for free every single turn. A Sol Ring only has one purpose, and it is really good at it: speeding up your deck. And now that we're on the topic of absolutely insane acceleration cards, Dark Ritual. For 1 black mana, you get to add 3 black mana to your mana pool. And if you have this card in your opening hand, it does enable some absolutely bananas turn 1 plays. You can drop your Oppression on turn 1, which will just absolutely destroy everyone's hands. You can start the game off with a Bottomless Pit on the battlefield from as early as turn 1, which will decimate your opponent's hands and guarantee you a huge amount of cards of Tinybones. And you can even drop your Hot Mummy as early as turn 1, which will obviously be really hard to deal with for any of your opponents. Asylum Visitor, a 2 mana vampire wizard that at the beginning of each player's upkeep will check if that player is hellbent. If they are, just like Tinybones, we lose 1 life and we get to draw 1 card. And as you can imagine, with all of the discard effects and discard engines we are playing, this is a really easy requirement to meet, and we will be drawing a huge amount of cards of this creature. And on top of that, just like our Necrogoyf, this card also has the Madness mechanic, meaning we can actually use this as a target for our own self-discard effects, and we will then just be able to cast it anyways. Chthonian Nightmare, a 2 mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will give us 3 energy counters. And by paying X energy, returning this card to our hand and sacrificing a creature, we get to return any creature in our graveyard with mana value X or less straight to the battlefield. A card that, just like Fraction Reclamation, is a fantastic recursion piece for any of our 2-drop discard fodder creatures. You can just sacrifice any of these ETB creatures you already have on the battlefield and you don't have a use for anymore, get a new one back, you will get the ETB trigger and your opponents will have to discard again. And you can just keep using this card over and over again. And if you do have this card in your hand or on the battlefield, it is a really nice way to actually bypass any sort of commander tax you have to pay. Because whenever Tinybones does get removed, instead of making it go to the command zone, you can just make it go to your graveyard, and you can just keep recurring him over and over again because he does have a low mana cost of only 2 mana, making him the perfect target for your Chthonian Nightmare. Containment Construct, a 2 mana artifact creature that whenever you do discard a card gives you the option to exile it instead. If you do, you get the ability to play that card from exile until the end of the turn. And this simple creature will make sure we don't feel any downside of actually discarding cards ourselves. Because let's say you're using your Liliana of the Veil with this creature on the battlefield, you can just choose choose to discard any card you do want to play this turn, and you will be able to do so straight from exile, not actually losing any value to the self-discard. And since this card does read play from exile and not cast from exile, you can actually discard lands with this on the battlefield and you will be able to make your land drop from the turn straight from exile. Doughty Voidwalker, a 2-drop creature that whenever any card would be put into our opponent's graveyards will exile it with a void counter instead. Now first up, if you do have this creature on the battlefield against any sort of land recursion deck, an aristocrat deck, a self-mill deck, it will just absolutely ruin their day, because they won't be able to get anything into their graveyard and reanimate it later. And by sacrificing this creature, you get to pick any card exiled with a void counter on it, and you get to play it until the end of turn without even paying its mana cost. The amount of games I have won of this effect is just absolutely insane. Because your opponents will be discarding this many cards, they will even have to discard their own win cons and their biggest creatures. I have cast an Italia of this effect, I have cast an Elesh Norn of this effect. In one game I was even able to cast an Omniscience of this effect. And my favorite part about this card is how well that it does synergize with our recursion tools like our Chthonian Nightmare and our Phyrexian Reclamation. Because you can just sack this creature, cast one of your opponent's win cons, and then you can just recur it on a later turn and do it all over again. Fun fact, even if your Doughty Voidwalker would leave the battlefield, if you then recur it on a later turn, all the cards exiled with the previous instant of the card will still have a void counter. And you will also be able to play all of those with your new instance of the Voidwalker. Boggart Trawler, a 3-mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield allows you to exile any player's graveyard. And since nowadays in modern day Magic almost every deck is using their graveyard, a card like this one can just shut down an opponent's entire strategy. The best part about this card is the fact that it is an MDFC land. So if you don't need to exile anyone's graveyard, you can just play the backside of this card, which is a land that taps for a black mana and even enters the battlefield untapped for the low cost of 3 life. There's really no reason not to include this card in the deck. Crypt Ghost, a 4-mana creature that whenever you tap a swamp for mana will add 1 additional black mana to your mana pool. And since we are a mono black deck that plays a ton of swamp cards, whenever you do have a Crypt Ghost on the battlefield, you will essentially double all of your mana production, enabling you to easily cast any card in your hand, allowing you to easily be able to pay the 6 mana for Tinybones' activated ability and start closing out the game. And you will also be able to use all of the mana that Crypt Ghast produces you to pay for its Extort ability. Because whenever you do cast a spell with Crypt Ghast on the battlefield, the Extort mechanic will give you the option to pay a black mana, and when you do, each opponent will lose 1 life and you will get to gain 3 life. This deck really aims to win the game by slowly draining our opponents out, and Extort is just the perfect mechanic for it. And now let's get into the best card in the entire deck. Getz Grimoire, a 4-mana artifact that whenever any opponent discards a card, we get to draw a card. The amount of cards that you will draw of this effect is just absolutely insane. A Delirium Skeins will draw you up to 9 cards. Every time you use Liliana, you will get to draw 3 cards. Every time an opponent casts something with an oppression on the field, you will get to draw a card. And any of your 2-drop creatures will now draw you 3 cards whenever you play them. Yeah, if you have this card on the battlefield, you won't ever run out of cards anymore. This card also has a really crazy synergy with Words of Waste, because whenever you now draw a card, you can just pay 1 mana, replace a draw effect and make each opponent discard a card. You will get to draw 3 new cards in the process, and for as long as you have the mana available, you will be able to just keep using your Words of Waste, and you will easily be able to make your opponents go to 0 cards in their hands. Sangromancer, a 4-mana creature that whenever any creature an opponent controls would die or any opponent discards a card will gain you 3 life. Like you've already seen in the video, we do play a ton of effects that will cost us life, including Tinybones' draw trigger. And an effect like this will do more than just offset the life we lose to those effects, because whenever you now play any sort of removal spell or you make your opponent's discard, you will get to gain a huge amount of life in the process. With a simple Necrogoyf on the field, you will gain 9 life per turn cycle. Every time you use a Liliana, you will gain 9 life. And whenever you do have an oppression on the battlefield, you will just gain an immense amount of life, and it will be really hard for your opponents to actually take you out of the game. Siphon Mind, for 4 mana, each opponent will have to discard a card. And now I know we do play way more efficient discard effects than this one, but in return we do get to draw a card for every card discarded this way. So in most cases, whenever your opponents have at least one card in their hand, this card will read discard 3, draw 3. And the last card in this section is Aklazots, a massive 5 mana 4/4 flying lifelink creature that whenever it attacks will make each opponent discard a card. For each opponent who can't do this, we get to draw a card, making it function as both a great discard engine or a fantastic way after our discard engines did their work to draw additional cards. And on top of that, whenever any opponent would discard a land card, we get to generate a 1/1 bat token with flying, which can be used as additional chum blockers, or you can use to just get additional flying combat damage through, just speeding up the pace you can close out the game with. And whenever this beautiful bat would die, instead of going to the graveyard, it will just return to the battlefield tapped with its backside up, which is a legendary land that will tap for a black mana and has an activated ability. For 3 mana, you get to transform this land back into its creature part, but you can only activate it if an opponent has 1 or fewer cards in their hand, which is a really easy requirement to meet in a discard deck, making this into a really big value creature that is actually really hard to deal with. If you're enjoying these in-depth deck videos and you want to support my cat, who just like Tinybones is a little Trinket Thief, make sure to check out the YouTube membership program. All members will get early access to the decklists of these videos, exclusive Discord channels where I'm always sharing what I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. And a big thanks to all the current YouTube members. Thanks to you, I can keep pouring all of my love and passion for Magic into these weekly deck videos, and I will never take that for granted. Next up, we have our win conditions. Once our opponents are hellbent and completely locked out of the game, these are the cards that will help us advance towards a win. They will turn all of our discarding and resource denial into real damage. Quest for the Nihil Stone, a 1 mana enchantment that whenever an opponent discards a card will get a quest counter. And once you get to 2 or more quest counters, its second ability will be active, which at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep will check if that player is hellbent. If they are, they will lose a massive 5 life. Yeah, getting your opponents to hellbent status isn't really all that hard to do in this deck. And this simple enchantment you can drop as early as turn 1 will just start chunking them for huge amounts of damage. And a really similar card is Shrieking Affliction, another 1 mana enchantment that at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep will check how many cards they have in their hand. If they have 1 or fewer cards in their hand, they will lose 3 life. It won't do as much damage as our quest, but in return it will also trigger even if they still have 1 card left. Bandit's Talent, a 2 mana class card that is one of my personal favorite cards in the entire deck. Whenever it enters a battlefield, each opponent has to discard 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card. So already the turn this comes down, it will already generate you some immediate value in the form of discarding and in the form of giving you Tinybones triggers. By investing 1 additional black mana into it, you can make it go to its second level, which will function in exactly the same way as a Shrieking Affliction, but it will only deal 2 damage instead of the 3. And you can make it go to its final level for 4 mana. That at the beginning of your draw step will draw you an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in their hand, which obviously later in the game will draw you an additional 3 cards whenever it is your turn. Yeah, the value on this card is just absolutely insane. It gives you discard triggers, a way to drain down your opponents, and a huge amount of additional card draw. And you get all of that on just a 2 mana card. Liliana's Scarus, a classic 2 mana enchantment that almost any discard deck uses as a win con. Whenever any opponent discards a card, they will lose 2 life. So instead of checking how many cards an opponent has in their hand during their upkeep, we now get to deal immediate damage whenever we make our opponents discard, synergizing really well with all of the one-time discard effects we play in this deck. Nazumi Shortfang, one of those weird old 180 flip cards. For 2 mana you get a 1/1 creature that for 2 mana and tapping it will make target opponent discard a card. Now, like I mentioned, making opponents discard on instant speed is actually a really good thing, because it will ensure us that we can get an additional Tinybones trigger during another player's turn. And you can also use this to make opponents discard before ever getting to their main phase. And after this effect resolves and that opponent has no cards in their hand, you get to rotate this card, which will turn it into Stab Whisker the Odious, a creature that at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep will check how many cards they have in their hand, and then they will lose 1 life for each card fewer than 3. So this card will both give us an instant speed discard effect, and once we get to flip it, it actually functions as a win con in this deck. The Raven Man. At the beginning of each end step, this creature will check if any player discarded a card this turn. If they did, we get to generate a flying 1/1 Raven token that can block. Now obviously in this deck we are trying to make every player discard at least 1 card during any given turn. This card will then generate us 4 1/1 flying tokens every turn cycle, and the amount of damage these little 1/1 flying tokens can do adds up really quickly, especially when combined with all of our other slow drain damage dealing effects. Because keep in mind, since our opponents will constantly be discarding, they will also be discarding any sort of answer they have for our army of ravens. Now that ability alone would already be enough to include discard in the deck, but on top of that, for 4 mana and tapping this creature, we can make each opponent discard a card. A perfect way to get additional discard, a Tinybones trigger, and to trigger his own ability and start generating us those ravens. Tinybones, Bauble Burglar, the alternate universe version of our commander, that whenever any opponent discards a card will exile it from their graveyard with a stash counter on it. And during our turn we get to cast any card with a stash counter on it straight from exile, and we get to spend mana as though it was any color. And this card functions in a similar way as a Doughty Voidwalker. Whenever you have this card on the battlefield and you just start doing your thing, making opponents discard all of their stuff, all of a sudden you will now have access to a huge amount of additional spells to cast. You can start casting their removal spells, their card draw spells, their value enchantments, and you can even start using their own win cons against them. If this little Skelly boy can just stick to the battlefield for a couple of turns, he will give you access to like 10 to 20 cards from your opponents that they discarded, and you will just be playing their own decks against them. And he also has exactly the same activated ability as the Raven Man. For 4 mana and tapping him, each opponent has to discard a card, fueling his own passive ability and just giving us access to another discard engine. Waste Not, an auto-inclusion in any sort of discard deck. It's a 2 mana enchantment that will generate us value depending on the card type that an opponent discards. If they discard a creature, we get to generate a 2/2 zombie token. If they discard a land card, we get to generate 2 black mana. And if they discard any sort of other card, we get to draw a card. And obviously all of the options on this card are just absolutely fantastic. We can use the zombies during combat to just chunk down our opponent's life totals. The mana will allow us to just deploy multiple of our win condition engines, and the card draw will just make sure we never ever run out of gas. And I don't think that I have to mention, whenever you play a Delirium Skeins with this on the battlefield, it will just generate you an immensely huge tempo swing, and usually your opponents won't ever be able to come back from this, because their resources will be stripped, and a Waste Not will just generate us an insane amount of value. Megarim, a 3 mana enchantment that has exactly the same effect as a Liliana Scarus. Whenever any opponent discards a card, they will take 2 damage. Wheel of Torture, a 3 mana artifact that has exactly the same effect as our Stab Whisker. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they will lose 1 life for each card fewer than 3 they have in their hands. Although this is a little less efficient than most of the other win cons we play in the deck, the more of these type of cards we have available to us, the faster we will win the game. Court of Ambition. Whenever this 4 mana enchantment enters the battlefield, we become the Monarch. And for as long as we do control the Monarch emblem, we will get to draw an additional card during our end step, already making it act as some sort of a cantrip. And at the beginning of each of our upkeeps, each opponent has to discard a card. If they can't, they will lose 3 life. When this trigger happens and we are the Monarch, instead of having to discard 1 card or lose 3 life, they will have to discard 2 cards or they will lose 6 life, which is actually a really huge number. Now, whenever you are the Monarch and an opponent does deal combat damage to you, they will get control of the Monarch emblem. But in this type of deck where our opponents will barely have any any resources due to the discarding, we will always have chum blockers on the battlefield, and we play a huge amount of creature removal, it will be nearly impossible for your opponents to steal your emblem. Entropic Battlecruiser, a 4 mana discard spacecraft we just got in the Edge of Eternity set. And this card has the station mechanic, meaning you can tap any creature you control to add charge counters onto this card equal to the tapped creature's power. And once you have one single charge counter on this card, whenever any opponent now discards a card, they will lose 3 life. And getting this thing to 1 charge counter is a really easy thing to do, because we will always have our Tinybones on the battlefield and we won't actually ever be swinging with him. And whenever you get this card to 8 or more charge counters, it will turn into a massive 3/10 flying death touch creature that whenever it attacks will make each opponent discard a card, and if they can't, they will lose 3 life. Now I'm gonna be honest, it is really hard to get to the 8 charge counters, and in most cases it is better to leave this card on the battlefield as an artifact and not a creature, because that way it is actually way harder for your opponents to actually remove. Painful Quandary, a massive 5 mana enchantment that whenever any opponent casts a spell gives them the option to either discard a card or they will lose 5 life. One of the best game finishers in the entire deck, because it will either function as an oppression effect, making opponents discard a huge amount of their cards, or whenever they are in top deck mode and they only have 1 card in their hand, which will happen a lot when they are playing against this deck, they will lose a massive 5 life whenever they do cast their card. And just keep in mind that it will be nearly impossible for your opponents to ever deal with this type of effect, because they will prefer keeping all of their high value cards in their hand, and they will just be discarding things like enchantment removal earlier in the game against any sort of discard effect we play. Psychosis Crawler, a 5 mana artifact creature that will have power and toughness equal to the amount of cards we have in our hand. And usually with the amount of cards we will be drawing off Tinybones, this will be like a 4/4 or a 6/6 body, which is actually quite nice to start swinging at your opponents with. But the main reason this card is included is its passive effect. Whenever we draw a card, each opponent will lose 1 life. And this damage does add up really quickly, because now whenever we do get a Tinybones trigger, we will get to ping down the table. And just imagine having both a Getz Grimoire and this creature on the battlefield. From there it will usually take you like 1 or 2 turns and you will have won the game by then. And the last card in this section is a Sepulchral Primordial, a massive 7 mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow you for each opponent to pick 1 creature from their graveyard and put it onto the battlefield under your control. Yeah, it isn't the best card in the deck by any means, but it is the perfect fit for this budget version of the deck. At some point, your opponents will just have to discard their biggest creatures in their decks, and this ability will always have some really big targets. Just the fact that you get your own huge creature body plus 3 additional big win-con creatures will enable you to close out the game really quickly on a next turn. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. Even though we will be stripping our opponent's removal and high threat creatures from their hands by making them discard, we still do need ways to protect our own value engines and to make sure we have the answers available whenever any of our opponents do get a value creature through. Defile. For 1 mana on instant speed, we can give any creature on the battlefield -X/-X until the end of turn. X being the amount of swamps we control. And this is just a really efficient removal spell, especially in a mono black deck where we will always be controlling a huge amount of basic swamps. You can cast this early in the game to just remove any value creature like an Esper Sentinel or a Loto, or later in the game whenever you do control a huge amount of swamps, you can actually use this to just remove any big threat on the battlefield. Unearth. For 1 mana, we get to return any creature with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. A really nice way to just recur any of our 2-drop discard bodies. A nice way to bypass any sort of commander text by just making our Tinybones go to our graveyard. And my favorite use of the card is just getting back our Doughty Voidwalker and getting additional uses out of him. This card also has the cycling mechanic, meaning whenever you don't need this effect, you can just pay 2 generic mana, discard this card, and you will get to replace it with a new card. Feed the Swarm, a card that will allow us to destroy any creature or enchantment on the battlefield, and we will lose life equal to its mana cost. Now, as you will see later in this section, we do play a huge amount of creature removal, but a Feed the Swarm actually does give us the the option to deal with any sort of enchantment, which actually is quite a rare thing to do in mono black colors. Infernal Grasp. For 2 mana, 2 life, we get to destroy any creature on instant speed. Efficient removal we can use whenever anyone resolves their high value commander. Liliana's Triumph. For 2 mana on instant speed, this spell will make each opponent sacrifice a creature. Now our opponents will barely control any creatures against this deck because they will sit in their graveyard due to being discarded, but we can't actually make our opponents discard their commanders. They will always have them available to cast. And Liliana's Caress is just the perfect card to deal with those. You can just keep 2 mana open, and whenever anyone is playing their commander, you can just cast a spell and it will instantly get sacrificed. And a nice little touch is that whenever you do control a Liliana Planeswalker when you cast this spell, each opponent will also have to discard a card. Now with us only playing 1 Liliana in the deck, the odds of this happening are really small. But when it does happen, the value this 2 mana spell will give you is just insane. Big Game Hunter. I don't know why, but I just like to point out that there is a card in Hearthstone that has exactly the same name and a really similar effect. Whenever this card enters the battlefield, we get to destroy any creature with power 4 or greater. A really solid removal tool that allows us to deal with any big creature, but the main reason this card is included in the deck is because we can cast it for 1 black mana whenever we discard it thanks to the Madness mechanic. Acting both as a fodder card we can use for any self-discard effect that will allow us to remove any creature in the process. Withering Torment. A card that just like a Fetus Swarm will allow us to deal with either an enchantment or a creature, and even though it will cost us 1 mana more, we do get 2 life in return when we cast it. Fel the Profane. For 4 mana we get to remove a creature on instant speed. Now honestly, this isn't the most efficient card, but just like I explained with a Bogger Trawler, you should view this card as a land card because you can just play the backside if you don't need its effect, which is a land that will just tap for a black mana and can even enter the battlefield untapped if you wanted to. Languish. For 4 mana, all creatures on the battlefield will get -4/-4 until the end of turn. Basically the only board wipe that's included in the deck. In some games, your opponents will just get a ton of value on the board before you have your discard engines ready, and a Languish really solves that problem, just resetting everything they did in the early turns. If you don't care about a €100 budget for this deck, you can totally replace this card with a Damnation, which has exactly the same purpose, but it will even deal with bigger creatures. Rankle. Master of Pranks. A 4 mana flying haste creature that whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent will allow you to pick 1 or more of its 3 options. The first option will make each player discard a card, which obviously is just fantastic for this deck. The second option will allow each player to draw a card and lose 1 life, something you can use to just ensure that opponents do have cards in their hand to actually discard. And the third option makes every player sacrifice a creature, a fantastic ability to control the board with, and we will always have sacrifice fodder creatures on the battlefield anyways. And thanks to Rankle having both haste and evasion built in, you will get immediate value whenever you cast him. Rankle's Prank. The spell version of Rankle without a creature body attached, but all of its effects are double as efficient. You can make each player sacrifice 2 creatures, discard 2 cards, or everyone will lose 4 life. And the best option on this card is actually the each player sacrifices 2 ability, which will just ensure that none of your opponent's creatures can actually stick to the board and will slow them down by a huge amount. Will of the Abzan. Whenever you cast this card, you get to pick 1 out of its 2 options. The first option will make each opponent sacrifice a creature and they will lose 3 life. A really great way to control the board and just ping down opponents even further. And the second option will allow you to just reanimate any creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, which you can use to get your discard bodies or your Doughty Voidwalker back. And the best part about this card is that whenever you do have your commander on the battlefield, you actually get to pick both options, which pushes this card absolutely over the top, both crippling your opponent's boards, making them lose life, and recurring any of your value creatures. Archfiend of Ifnir. A 5 mana creature that whenever you discard or cycle a card will put a -1/-1 counter on each creature that your opponents control. Now obviously with all of the self-discarding we will be doing in this deck, this card can just set up for some continuously one-sided board wiping. The main reason I did decide to include this card in the deck is because I do play in a ton of really creature-heavy pots myself, and an Archfiend of Ifnir just ruins their entire game plan. Curtain Skull. An instant speed spell that will allow us to destroy 2 target creatures. And it also has the Undaunted mechanic, meaning its cost will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each opponent that's still in the game, making this into a really efficient removal spell that will remove 2 target creatures for the low cost of 3 mana. Next up we have the lands, and since this is a monocolored budget deck, the mana base isn't anything fancy. We are playing a couple of utility lands and I'll start by going over those. A Cursed Dunyard. For 2 mana and tapping this land we get to either regenerate target Shade, Spectre, Spirit, Vampire, Wraith, Zombie, and most importantly, Skeleton, giving us the ability to protect our Tinybones from any sort of spot removal or board wipes for just 2 mana. Bojuka Bog, a card that just like a Boggart Trawler, whenever it enters the battlefield will allow us to exile any player's graveyard. A fantastic ability on something as simple as a land that will just shut down any sort of reanimation, landfall or spellslinger deck. Emergence Zone. For 1 mana and sacrificing this land we get to cast any spell this turn on instant speed. Later in the game this is a fantastic tool to cast any of your sorcery speed discard spells during an opponent's turn and get an additional Tinybones trigger. Or whenever your opponents are hellbent, you can use this effect to make an opponent discard before they go to their main phase and they just won't have anything to play that turn. Gaia Reach Sanitarium, one of the most broken lands in this entire deck. For 2 mana and tapping it, you can make each player draw a card and then discard a card. Yeah, this effect is just incredibly busted. You can use it to just dig deeper into your deck. You can use this to enable any sort of madness card. You can make all of your opponents discard an additional card, triggering all of our damage effects, and you can guarantee a Tinybones trigger during an opponent's turn. And this card just scales incredibly well with Get's Grimoire, because when you have this on the battlefield, whenever you now activate this land, you will get to draw 4 cards and only discard 1, which is absolutely busted for just 2 mana. And we're also playing a Reliquary Tower. Like you can imagine, with all of the cards we will be drawing of things like Tinybones and Get's Grimoire, there will be a ton of situations where you will have a gazillion cards in your hand. And whenever you then do control a Reliquary Tower, you won't even have to discard down to hand size. And for basics, we're playing 28 Swamps. If you want to push this deck even further and you don't care about a €100 budget, if you go over to my decklist on Moxfield, you enable tags, you scroll down to the considering section, you can see which cards I would be including in the deck. And I will be flashing into the screen the card swaps I'd make to include these upgrades. And that's it for my in-depth Tinybones Trinket Thief deck tech. A commander that doesn't just generate you value, but that completely dismantles your opponent's ability to actually play the game. Instead of racing towards a win or trying to assemble any fancy combo, this deck wins by doing one of the most brutal things you can do in Magic: emptying everyone's hands, choking out their resources, and turning every discard into more value for yourself. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a skull emoji in the comments below. Share this video with any Magic player you know that just absolutely hates discard based decks. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's video. Thanks for watching, enjoy ripping apart your opponent's hands, and I will see you in the next one.